Hey friends, thanks so much for tuning in. It's nice to have you back. It really is. And it's nice to have back our good friend Jeff Nielson, whose work you can catch at Sprott Money and, of course, over at sgtreport.com. Jeff, how are you, sir?
Doing pretty good. How about yourself?
Well, I'm hanging in there. And, of course, you're up there in Canada. How's life in Canada, sir?
Well, we've been seeing a little bit of sun now and then. All in all, not too bad a fall.
Yeah, not too bad a fall here either. It's been quite temperate. It's kind of nice. The transition into the cold weather coming slowly is exactly what I want at my age. You know, the older we get, Jeff, the less likely we are to want to live in these freezing cold climates.
Well, and it's kind of a metaphor for just how it's more difficult for us to deal with adversity with age in general. And, at the same time, most of the people who are aware of the serious problems we have in our own societies tend to be, the older or middle-aged half of the population. And then that, in a sense, creates part of our dilemma.
Yeah, you're right. And as we talk about the coming collapse of the dollar, right, the economic collapse and the global economic problems in general that we cover at SGT Report and that you report about, it is the people on food stamps. It is the infirmed. It is the sick. It is the elderly. It is so many of these people that are going to be crushed if and when the dollar dies. I mean, look what's going on in Venezuela, for instance, Jeff. I was watching a report today that says a cab ride to the beach cost $158. I think that came from Sovereign Man. $158 because Venezuela, the Venezuelan dollar, is hyperinflating. Hyperinflation of your currency will kill you, won't it?
It will certainly kill you if you don't have a protected currency. And of course, this brings us into the whole topic of serial currency manipulation. I don't know if all of your readers are aware of this, but the big banks, primarily the Wall Street big banks, have now been criminally convicted of serially manipulating all of the world's currencies, including the US dollar, including the euro. The conviction dates back to serial manipulation going as far back as the end of 2007, before all of the whole crash of '08 insanity began. So since that time, these currencies have been completely rigged. Obviously, Venezuela is not a friendly nation of the U.S., and so of course its currency is not protected, and so we see its currency get subjected to this relentless attack. We saw India's currency subjected to a severe attack. We've seen Russia's currency subjected to a severe attack because they're not part of the Western cabal, and it's just another example of the total saturation criminality which exists in every aspect of our international monetary system.
Yeah, well said. You know, I want to ask you something here. I've been covering this a lot with everybody else, so I want your opinion. You know, you follow the work of John Williams, of course, as do we. And John Williams was saying back in 2011 when I made my micro documentary called The Silver Perspective, he was saying at that point that the inflation adjusted all-time high for silver based on Fed money printing M1, M2, M3 was $138 an ounce. Now, back at the time I made that video, silver had just passed $20 an ounce. Fast forward to 2015, and now John Williams says that the inflation-adjusted all-time high for silver is $601 an ounce and climbing, and now silver's at $15. And you know, Jeff, when people say silver will never, ever, and cannot ever go to $200, $300, $400, $500, $600 an ounce, I say, really? Do you know what's going on in Venezuela right now? Do you know that the Pentagon can't account for $8.5 trillion? Do you know that the Fed's balance sheet contains $2.5 trillion in treasuries because it is the buyer of last resort? I don't think people have any idea what's really going on. And to hear you say that the banks, the criminal banks, have been manipulating the currencies since even before the last collapse makes perfect sense because this entire paradigm is run by criminals.
Well, and that point you raised with John Williams is so useful. And in fact, I hadn't seen that, so I'm glad you passed it along to me. And of course, the idea of silver being priced at $600 an ounce today seems outlandish to people because of the extreme manipulation. But then perhaps your readers will recall a commentary that I published a few months ago which was titled literally $1,000 an ounce for silver, a fair price starting point for today. And the metric I used to come up with that figure for a price for silver today was based on some analysis by Rob Kirby, someone else I'm sure that your audience is familiar with. And his point was that the average wage throughout history, which was often paid in silver, worked out to roughly 1 ounce of silver per week. And if you look at the average paper dollar wage for people today and then equate that, then that, is say roughly a figure of $50,000 a year or roughly $1,000 per ounce of silver. So if we converted an average wage to a fair market price for the value of silver, that's what Rob Kirby suggests is dictated, and that would seem to be a very rational metric for analysis as well. So, you get two different reputable people uh, approaching this question from totally different perspectives and getting to relatively similar figures. And so readers should definitely think seriously about what that signifies.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what happens, Jeff, is people tend to lose perspective. We've been separated from our history of honest money, so they lack perspective. And I want to give people a little perspective right now. Think about this. Going back to early 2000, 2001, Jeff, when I was not fully awake about the criminal monetary system and the criminal Federal Reserve and the criminal central banks, I was still drinking the Kool-Aid and investing in 401ks and doing all of that stuff. I was aware that gold had bottomed and hit a multi-year low at around $260, $250, $270 an ounce. And I remember having a conversation with a buddy of mine who's a money manager, and he said, why would you want gold? It doesn't pay interest. We had a brief conversation about it. I never thought about it again. I didn't buy any. And my point is this. Most of the sheeple people out there are really not paying attention to gold and silver prices today either. So for silver to go to $200, $300, $400 an ounce, most people will not even be paying attention to it and will miss that opportunity. They're going to miss the opportunity to buy silver today more cheaply than they could have bought it in 2011, despite the inflation-adjusted all-time high being multiples higher than it was when John Williams said it was 138.
Well, I can totally relate to the personal anecdote you provided because it pretty much is similar to my own history. I certainly wasn't one of the uh, true visionaries who saw through this, 15, 20 years ago. I'm part of the second generation that sort of became awake after that point. And of course, looking back even further, simply none of us have ever been alive in a time when people automatically valued gold and silver as a primary asset in their wealth preservation and wealth management, something which has been taken for granted in every other culture throughout history. We've lived our entire lives with nothing but paper propaganda. You don't need to have real wealth, real money backing you, just the paper instruments of criminal bankers. And of course, if you're brainwashed with this propaganda every day of your life, it's going to be very difficult to think in different parameters. And this is the problem we're facing. You described your own situation. My situation is similar. Undoubtedly, most of the people listening to this have relatively similar stories. And then there is the 80, 90, 95% of the population which is still oblivious where we were 10, 15 years ago. So this is part of the problem, a lifetime of propaganda. And now we have to totally rethink about how we look at everything to do with commerce in the same way that people used to look at it automatically throughout their lives.
Yeah, yeah, well said. I have to tell people I found this interesting piece that you wrote over on your bulletin board at Bullion Bulls just the other day, and it's fascinating. I need you to help me understand this, Jeff. So, as you know, as the listeners know, Russia and China are actively ditching the dollar, and China specifically is hoarding gold about as fast as it can, right? And moving, and they feel trapped by the dollar. In their own words, they want to move off the dollar system. They feel trapped by it. Now, of course, if you take a look at the dwindling number of allies that the U.S. government has, you would count among those allies Germany. Now, we know that the Germans wanted their gold back, and the New York Fed really couldn't accommodate getting their gold back, and that became a big news story. Well, now you're writing that the German central bank accounts for all its gold in a 2,300-page document. This is fascinating to me, Jeff, because of course it would be the Germans who say, "Oh, there's no problem. No need to look over here. Here's 2,300 pages for you to understand why." Tell us about this incredible story.
Well, here we need to back up a little bit in history to sort of look at this whole silly, quote unquote, repatriation melodrama. And going back, I guess it's more than a year and a half now, Germany's government, under considerable political pressure, made a formal request to have some of its gold returned to it, quote unquote, repatriated.
From the New York Fed.
And a small portion was also to come from France. And of course, the point here is the total amount of gold that Germany was requesting to get back was only about 20% of its entire reserves. So it's not like it was even trying to recapture the entire 3,000 plus tons, which the German government still pretends to have title to. It was simply trying to get back 20% of that gold. And even more ludicrous is this repatriation program was to be spread over multiple years, as if transporting a few hundred tons of gold, it was some logistical operation that couldn't be handled in a few weeks. So, the entire proposal was ludicrous. And then as it unfolded, what we actually saw was Germany getting nothing. In the first year of this scheme, basically the only gold that actually made it back onto German soil was a tiny dribble of gold that came from France. Practically nothing at all came from the US. And then, of course, things get really surreal. During this period of time, we get this other report surfacing in the media that suddenly the Netherlands government has managed to, quote unquote, secretly repatriate a big chunk of its gold reserves. More than 100 tons of gold, which is a significantly larger percentage of its total reserves, and it got all of its gold apparently in just a few weeks. So, of course, this immediately raised a lot of eyebrows, and my first reaction was to treat this as a serious news item that somehow the Netherlands had gotten its gold back, very possibly as quid pro quo for cooperation
MH17.
in some of the U.S.'s geopolitical schemes.
Yeah.
But then, of course, we get this further, even more bizarre twist, which is suddenly we get this announcement from Germany that instead of the public and open repatriation of gold, which was originally proposed, which presumably would have involved open shipments, we now get this this notification from Germany's government that it is, quote unquote, secretly repatriated some of its gold. It couldn't get any gold at all openly in a year, but when it decided to do the same thing secretly, all of a sudden, supposedly hundreds of tons of gold flowed from the US into Germany. And of course, the big joke with regard to this whole concept of secret repatriation is that nobody sees the gold. So, it's just a comedy where we go from having these quote unquote gold reserves, which no one has seen inside the United States for 50 plus years, and the gold is quote unquote secretly repatriated across an ocean to Germany, where now nobody will see that gold ever. So then it's with that context in mind that we get this latest report from Germany's government. Nobody needs to worry anymore. All the gold is around. Here it is inside a 2,300 page stack of paper. Well, I challenge any reader to find a way to have 3,000 plus tons of gold contained in a 2,300 page stack of paper. It's just window dressing. There's no iota of validity to this. If, of course, the whole question of the security of Germany's gold could have been dealt with a stack of paper, the concept of repatriation would have never surfaced in the first place. So, we just get more and more bizarre and pathetic attempts to quote unquote prove this gold is there. And it basically brings to mind one of my favorite Shakespeare cliches. The lady dost protest too much, methinks. And it's the old logic of the more somebody has to insist something over and over and over again, insisting the same thing, the less credibility we can place in that assertion.
Yeah, very well said. A 2,300 page report about how Germany has found its gold reminds me a little bit of the 9/11 Commission report. Let's just throw a big book at the American people, and they haven't been paying attention, so they're going to think that we really have investigated this. And here's all the answers. Here's how it happened. And if you read it, there are no answers. In fact, 70% of the family's questions went unanswered. And go ahead.
Sorry, and what's so totally perverse about such massive whitewashing campaigns is that the average person hears, 2,000 pages, and this impresses them. This supposedly adds additional weight and credibility to the report simply because of its length, when the reality is that with reports like this, which are all drafted and written by lawyers, the greater the quantity of pages simply means the greater the capacity for lying. If Germany wanted to try to prove the existence of its gold via report, it could do so in a much, much shorter document, a couple of pages,
Hmm.
with specific references to the specific public audit, which coincided with each particular stash of German gold in the various locations it's supposed to be located. That's all it would require. Public audits and a small document listing those, in fact, public audits. That would prove the existence of the gold. But of course, public audits, that's an oxymoron in our current society. Nothing is public, nothing is audited.
Yeah. All right, Jeff. Well, let me ask you here. Before we let you go, I do want to talk about the derivatives market. You recently wrote for Sprott Money, the derivatives market, bets, bookies, and fraud. And the takeaway is that the derivatives market is nothing but a casino. The derivatives market is the key to the unwinding and the collapse of the entire global economic Ponzi scheme. How does this derivatives market finally end?
Well, the problem with trying to forecast an end to this particular massive fraud is that it's a totally corrupt casino. It is so corrupt that we have literally seen the house refusing to pay when it loses. And this, of course, is a level of perversity which we never see, even with quote unquote illegal, underground casinos that exist all over the place. If the house refused to pay when it lost on its bets, it would be driven out of business.
I just
And
want to interrupt and say that is a powerful quote to help us really understand how bad the organized crime and the fraud is. You're right. The house refuses to pay when it loses. Not even Vegas can get away with that.
And this is precisely what we saw in the derivatives market. When Greece defaulted on its debts back in 2011, 75% of its debt was wiped clean. The criminals in this derivatives market who were supposedly insuring all this debt simply said there was no default.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't have to pay off. And of course, this is where we see how absolutely perverted this bookies operation is. In a normal bookie operation, which is all that the derivatives market is, the bookies are only allowed to take bets. The bookies are never allowed to place bets in their own uh, betting operations because it would allow them to rig the bets. Because of course, with any bookmaking operation, as the bets stack up on one side or the other, it moves the odds and thus changes the price of the bets and thus changes the betting market itself. So obviously, bookies can never be allowed to bet in their own market, but not in the derivatives bookie operation. In the derivatives bookie operation, not only are the bookies allowed to bet, but the bookie betting dominates all other betting by a factor of 10. More than 90% of all the bets are placed by the bookies. So, and of course, with the betting rigging the market, this indicates just how rigged the derivatives market is itself. It is the epitome of fraud. It is impossible to theoretically conceive of fraud this extreme in any other possible form. And it's totally unregulated. The criminals are, I say it's totally unregulated. It is officially, quote unquote, self-regulated. The criminals regulate their own crime. So this is the question you're asking me. With the criminals regulating their own crime, when will the crime come to an end? Put in that context, the readers can see how absurd this situation has gotten.
Well, okay, well, let's flush this out then just a bit further, because when the house refuses to pay when it loses, it turns to taxpayers, right? It turns to the people to bail them out. The house is going to rape the people to pay for these bets. They're just stealing, Jeff. They're looting. That's why $8.5 trillion went out the back door of the Pentagon. Let me read this to you. This is from an exchange from Rick Santelli and Lacey Hunt, which appeared on CNBC. And, as the Fed now talks about negative interest rates, that is the overt warning that they are now going to rape, pillage, and steal from savers. And Lacey Hunt said this in an exchange with Santilli.
What about just the average person on the street? If we see overnight rates moving negative, they're negative all the way out to half the curve in Europe, how would the average person be affected, if at all?
Well, the average person's bulk of their assets are fixed income investments. And so then they would have to pay the banks a safekeeping fee. It would be very onerous. It would have a devastating impact on the money market mutual funds. Over time, it would aggravate the earnings capacity of the insurance companies. It would adversely affect the banks, their earning capacity. And it would also increase the unfunded liabilities of the corporate pension plans. If the Fed were to engineer the negative rates for any more than a short period of time, to make it effective, they would actually have to call in the currency. Because as long as currency were a viable option, there would be tremendous currency disintermediation. People would begin to hold currency rather than to pay to have funds in a short-term asset.
Now, Jeff, I just wanted to play that for you. You heard it from Lacey Hunt himself. It would be very onerous for savers, for people of this nation, if the Fed engineers negative interest rates. Is this not the smoking gun of absolute criminality? Is this not the proof that they need and are going to steal from the people?
Well, here I would first point to the somewhat euphemistic language which was used by this media talking head. When he spoke about, quote unquote, calling in the currency, what he was explicitly referring to is what we've been talking about for months as a ban on cash.
Right.
People no longer being allowed to hold cash. And then he goes on with a further euphemism about remediation, which was basically nothing but another euphemism for a run on the banks.
Right.
So this is part of the problem that's faced when readers get even a quasi-realistic glimpse of where this criminality is leading, is immediately the people talking about this plunge in a euphemistic language which covers up the actual financial atrocity being postulated.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. But to say they would have to call in the currency, I mean, to anybody paying attention, most people miss that clip. You and I are talking about it. Some of the readers and viewers have seen it. But to see that exchange on CNBC is a really rare moment of truth. It seems most of the truth that comes out of CNBC comes out of Santelli. I mean, without Santelli, there would be no truth ever coming out of CNBC. You know, you'd only get the screaming guy telling you to buy stocks at the end of the day, Kramer. I'll tell you, Jeff, we definitely live in a financial monetary matrix. We can see the matrix, but so many of the people we know are absolutely embedded in the matrix, so much so that they probably have little hope of escaping before this whole house of cards comes down.
And what's interesting is I started using that movie metaphor myself a couple years ago. I've seen it spreading. I've seen more and more people using that metaphor because it's the only way to quickly capture this fantasy world we have where a small percentage are aware of what the real world still looks like, but the vast majority are totally asleep. Except the difference is that in the movie version, there was a literal virtual reality machine into which people were physically plugged in. In our Wonderland Matrix, we have a propaganda matrix. We have people voluntarily plugging in their minds to this saturation propaganda, which turns off the thinking process, as does any form of brainwashing. And thus they go through their lives totally asleep, believing this fairy tale that they're fed day after day by the mainstream media.
Yeah. Well, that's why you exist, and that's why we exist, and that's why the alt media is growing as CNN enjoys all-time low numbers of viewership. Guys, our guest has been Jeff Nielson. You can find Jeff's work over at Sprott Money. That's probably the best place to find your work now, huh, Jeff?
That's one of my newest platforms. It's a company I'm very happy to have a publishing deal with, and of course they have a fine reputation throughout the world of gold and silver.
Yeah, they do. And of course, you guys can find Jeff's work posted over at sgtreport.com as well. And we do thank you, Jeff, for your time.
Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, my friend. And guys, we thank you for your time as well. Thanks for clicking play, and thanks for supporting us over at sgtreport.com. And do check us out over at thephaser.com, where I hand select items, sometimes a bit more esoteric and a little further down the rabbit hole than you'll see at SGT Report, and thelibertymill.com, which shares truth 24/7. Thanks so much, guys, and we wish you the very best weekend ahead. God bless.